Math, the topic's so nice. All right, so now we're going to be doing example number 5. We're going to list the sample space of possible outcomes for tossing a coin. So we're into sort of explaining what a sample space looks like. What can come out of tossing a coin? Your sample space, two things can happen. It could be a heads or it could be a tails. So what we see is that we have two outcomes. If we toss two coins, oh yeah. So tossing two coins, what could happen? Now here, I'm going to say order matters. Now, I could have a heads and then a tails, right? I could flip a heads and then a tails. Okay, I'm actually going to take that away. I'm going to try to create some systematic way of doing this, keeping it order. Heads, and then on one coin, on the second coin, it could also be a heads. When I toss coins again, the first coin I could toss a heads, but this time I could toss a tails on the second coin. Or I could toss a tails on my coin, my first coin, my second coin I could toss a heads. First coin I could toss a tails, and the second coin I could also toss a tails. So really those are the four outcomes of tossing two coins. Heads, 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 tails, tails, heads, tails, tails. So here we notice that there are four outcomes. Now I treat these two as different outcomes, and that's really important. So we're going to draw a tree diagram tossing two coins. So I'm just going to take this dot, and remember, we used the tree diagram very briefly. This dot signifies my first coin. What are the outcomes of my first coin? A heads or a tails. I should abbreviate them H and T. I'll do that for the next one. Now this signifies, these dots now signify flipping the second coin, my second action. So here I tossed a head on my first coin. What could happen? I could toss another head or I could toss a tail. Now if I flipped a tail on my first coin, on my second coin, it doesn't stop me, but I can toss a heads or I could toss a tail. I guess it's tails. So that's what this tree looks like. Now tossing three coins. Wow, this could take some time. Let me address this situation though. Here I could have heads, 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 tail, right? If I read heads, tails, here tails, and then heads, tails, and then heads, or tails, and then tails. So what we see is that there's 1, 2, 3, 4 outcomes. Tossing three coins now. Here's my first toss of the coin. I could toss a heads, or I could toss a tails. Great. Here's me flipping my second coin. Now if you notice, for every outcome I put another dot and I split it apart. My second coin, I could toss a heads or I could toss a tails. And again, I have to repeat that process. So here, this signifies flipping a heads, and then up here, this would be heads, 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 tails, tails, heads, tails, tails. We're not done because I have to flip another coin. So maybe I'm going to use orange. Now I'm going to have 4 different outcomes for flipping two coins. So now I have to flip a heads and a tails. Heads and a tails. Heads and a tails. Heads and a tails. So flipping 3 coin, there is 8 possible outcomes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. I'm going to write those outcomes, and if I gave you enough time, you would come out with these outcomes. The first one is heads, heads, heads. Second one is heads, heads, tails. So I'm just traveling down the branches. Third one is heads, tails, heads. Heads, tails, heads. This next one is heads, tails, tails. So then heads, tails, tails. So we're done with the upper branches here. So now I'm going to be moving to tails. We could have tails, heads, heads. So we could have tails, heads, heads. Tails, heads, tails. Tails, heads, tails. Tails, tails, heads. And last, tails, tails, tails. So wow, that took some time, but what we see is we have 8 outcomes. Whew, that was tough. All right. We're going to stop the video there. Continue on.